Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Before we begin this video, I would like to provide you with the last update to our crowdfunding campaign. After this update, we'll provide you with the final results on January 13th. So let's get to the update. As of January 9th, we have raised 60,000 euros thanks to 1,650 donors. Our target is to reach 80,000 euros, and with the amount raised so far, we can continue operating until September or October of next year. However, if we reach our target, we'll be able to make it through until next year's crowdfunding campaign. We are very thankful for everyone who has supported so far. However, the number 1,650 is fewer than the least watched videos on our channel. Our channel was watched over 360,000 times in December and January alone, and we have around 165,000 subscribers. That means less than 1% of people watching our channel have donated so far. If you're watching our channel regularly and have not donated, please consider doing so now, even if it's just 1 to 5 euros, or by simply sharing the link to our crowdfunding campaign within your network. There are only a few days left, and the actions of each and every one of you counts and will determine whether we can continue broadcasting in the coming months ahead. On the screen now, you will see a PayPal QR code appear. If you click on pause and scan it with your phone's camera, you'll be able to donate immediately without any hassle. For more detailed information on our crowdfunding campaign, past work, the challenges and costs that we faced this year, and how you can support us, you'll find out in the description of this video below. I thank you for your love, support, and generosity. Today, I'll be talking to Gregory Wilpert, who's a sociologist, journalist, and the founder of the website called Venezuelanalysis.com. He's also an author, and his book on Venezuela is called Changing Venezuela by Taking Power: The History and Policies of the Chavez Government. Gregory Wilpert, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
Thanks for inviting me. My pleasure.
Last year, in 2025, the United States sharply escalated pressure on Venezuela under the stated premise of narco-terrorism. This began with an expanded U.S. naval and air presence in the Caribbean, including the deployment of the USS Gerald Ford carrier strike group off Venezuela's coast, U.S. strikes on alleged drug smuggling speedboats in the Caribbean, and the seizure of Venezuelan oil shipments at sea. Beginning January 26, this escalation culminated in a special U.S. military operation inside Venezuela involving airstrikes and a raid in Caracas that resulted in the capture, or should I say kidnapping, of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, who were then flown to the United States to face federal charges in a New York court for drug smuggling in Venezuela. Venezuelan authorities report dozens of Venezuelan security personnel were killed, while Cuba has confirmed that more than 30 of its military and security personnel were killed as well. Vice President Delcy Rodríguez subsequently assumed power in Caracas. In the days that followed, the United States seized additional oil tankers, including a Russian-linked vessel, prompting strong condemnation from Moscow, which accused Washington of illegal seizures and warned of serious consequences. President Trump then stated that the U.S. would run Venezuela during a transitional period, including selling an estimated of its 30 to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil, with revenues placed under U.S. control. A plan senior U.S. officials described as part of a stabilization and transition effort. Can you first provide your assessment of the U.S. military operation in Venezuela and then talk about its significance?
Well, it was clearly an operation that was planned many months in advance. And it took everybody by surprise in a way, because constantly there had been talk of an actual invasion. And so I think Venezuela, the Venezuelan military and President Maduro were preparing for an actual bombing of perhaps some military installations or alleged drug trafficking installations or something like that. What they did not expect, it seems quite clearly, is that they would try to kidnap President Maduro. And so, first of all, even though that must have been in some realm of possibility for them, and clearly Maduro did have a very strong security detail, they weren't completely prepared. The other thing that they weren't prepared for was also the degree of technological sophistication with which this attack happened. It was combined with a cyber attack that brought down computer systems. It was attacked with probably some sort of electromagnetic pulse and radar suppression equipment that basically completely disabled Venezuela's anti-air or defenses, and then of course there was the element of surprise and speed, and then the noise to cover up the helicopter noise, and all of those kinds of things. So they just weren't equipped or prepared for that. So this was a very strong surprise attack. And I actually just recently read that President Maduro's wife, Celia Flores, who was also kidnapped, which we oftentimes forget to mention, she actually said that she wanted to go with him. This comes from a report actually by President Maduro's son. That's what he had heard in the meantime, that they didn't actually plan to take her, but she insisted on being taken along with them. I don't know if that's true, but that's the latest report I just saw. In terms of the larger significance, well, I mean, this is an extreme violation, as everyone has already said, of of national sovereignty and of international law. There's no doubt about it. There's no basis. I mean, the Trump administration keeps on claiming that this was a police action, kind of a law enforcement action. The U.S. does not have jurisdiction in Venezuela, no matter how Trump tries to spin it. That's just the fact, and heads of state enjoy immunity from this kind of action. This is a long-established international law, so there's no doubt this was a major violation of international law. And I would even claim that international law has been increasingly violated ever since the governments of, especially by the United States, ever since the presidency of I would say at least George W. Bush, that is Jr., is with the invasion of Iraq. Now that technically had a fig leaf of UN security approval, but not really. And then, of course, it was continued with other things such as the bombing of Libya and so on. So I would say this would basically put the nail, so to speak, into the coffin of international law, because now it seems to me that anything goes.
Let's take a step back before we continue the discussion on what happened and provide some broader context. Media coverage here in Germany when it comes to history often begins with Hugo Chávez coming to power and later Nicolas Maduro, focusing on their authoritarianism and human rights violations that followed during their tenure. What is largely missing, however, is a discussion of what Venezuela was like before Chávez. Could you outline the political, economic, and social conditions during that earlier period? Which international actors were involved, and what impact did that era have on Venezuelan society, particularly when it comes to social equality and human rights?
Yeah, it's really quite stunning the way, first of all, let me just quickly characterize the way I see the national media, the international media reporting on Venezuela. It's almost as if, like you said, Venezuelan history started with Chavez. And then, first of all, they always refer to him as being taking power in 1999, not mentioning that he was legitimately elected in 1999. Then it always says, and then he proceeded to completely destroy the country and drive it into economic ruin. That's more or less the kind of the typical way in which the trajectory is described. Now, this is actually completely false. What happened was Venezuela was, one of the more wealthier countries in Latin America. That is true, but that was in the 1970s, first of all. And then that was kind of the high point in terms of Venezuela's wealth, in terms of per capita GDP. And then it started declining throughout, especially in the 80s and 90s, and especially in the 90s. It's declined, and the inequality grew by an enormous amount, as well as did corruption and human rights violations. In '89, there was a massive massacre that killed, some people say, thousands of people. The official death toll was around 400, but of people who were rioting. And so, I mean, this history is completely, swept under the rug in the meantime, as if Chavez came to power through a coup in '99. It's true that he tried to organize a coup in '92 and failed, and then he decided to run for president through the democratic route, because there were some democratic reforms after his coup attempt, and gave him an opening essentially to run for president. He was pardoned, or his sentence was commuted, something like that. Anyway, So then he ran in '99 and won with a very solid majority. One of the first times, actually, in recent Venezuelan history that a president won with an absolute majority. In the previous presidents had won with as little. You only need a relative majority, according to Venezuelan constitution. So Chavez was the first one to get over 50% in a long time. Anyway, so that basically establishes the context that is usually completely left out. And it wasn't really until President Chavez's death in 2013 that Venezuela started a long economic decline, partly, I would say, through self-inflicted errors on the economic front. But I would say the majority of the fault for the economic decline is attributable to the decline in oil prices and to the massive sanctions that started being instituted in 2015 under Obama, actually, and then even made absolutely severe in 2019 and since then. So that's kind of a little bit more accurate, I would say, portrayal of what's happened since in the scope of recent Venezuelan history.
So let's take these sanctions and economic problems and put them into a bigger frame. So, for example, when I watch the German media, the external factors like sanctions and oil prices are usually, there's little weight put to them, and there's more weight put on economic mismanagement, corruption, and then on top of that you have Maria Machado, Nobel Peace Prize, standing for democracy and freedom, and the opposition's repression. Can you talk about which of these two, the internal or the external, which of these two should be more weighed heavily according to your own assessment?
Well, quite clear. And one of the things that maybe should be mentioned as well, I mean, before I go into this balance, is that one reinforces the other. So, for example, when sanctions were introduced in Venezuela, started to be introducing on a massive scale. They already started in 2006, we should remember, under George W. Bush. But those were very minor. They didn't really affect the economy that much. But in 2015, when they started introducing them, those made Venezuela's currency exchange problem pretty bad. And so Venezuela made the mistake, I would say, of holding on to a fixed exchange rate because they had lots of capital flight, partly because of the sanctions. And the fixed exchange rate gave lots of opportunities for corruption. And so you have a back and forth, really. I mean, if we're talking in kind of Marxist terms, a dialectic that is between the sanctions and between increasing corruption, and then compounding that is also economic mistakes in reaction to the sanctions. So if there hadn't been any sanctions, you'd have a completely different picture. It wouldn't have as much corruption, for example. But anyway, so I would say that one plays off of the other. First of all, that's the first thing that people should keep in mind. That there's a very strong interaction here of how sanctions actually contribute to corruption. But the other thing is that it cannot be denied that I would say at least 75–80% of the economic problems are attributable to the sanctions, because after all, Venezuela is an oil producing country that derives something like 95% of its foreign income from oil exports. And of course, a country like Venezuela has to use its foreign income in order to pay for imports. If you import 60% of your food supply, that means you have 95% less money. Let's say if all of that oil money were gone. That didn't happen, but I'm just saying 95% of that oil money were gone. That means you have 95% less money to import those 60% of food for your domestic consumption. That is massive. Now, like I said, it didn't happen that 95% completely disappeared, but it was something like 75% of the oil revenue disappeared. So in other words, you only have a quarter of the revenues left in order to import food that you previously had. That has a massive impact on people's ability to consume within the country, and on the per capita caloric consumption that you have. So that would lead obviously to malnutrition. That not only it affects, of course, food. The other important sector that it affects is medicines, with life-saving medicines that are not produced in Venezuela. Let's say for treating cancer, chemotherapy, HIV medicines. I mean, just it runs the entire gamut of what you can imagine in terms of life-saving medications. Even insulin is affected because that's not produced within Venezuela. So it's no surprise that, according to Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, when they did a study of the mortality rate after the 2015 sanctions were introduced, and especially, after the 2019 ones, because the 2019 sanctions basically cut off the entire oil market, Venezuela's oil ability to supply oil to the United States. And beyond that, actually, because it also cut Venezuela out of the international financial transaction systems. And so according to that study from 2019, for the first 2 years that the sanctions were in place, they estimate something like 40,000 people died as a result of the sanctions because mortality went up by that much. And there's no other explanation, really, because there was no war, but the effect was the same as if there had been a war. And so we can safely assume that probably over 100,000 people have died now because of the sanctions. Now, again, this is just to illustrate the severity of the sanctions and why I'm saying that at least 75%, if not more, of the economic problems that Venezuela suffered under was because of the sanctions. And this has also, of course, a massive impact also on Venezuela's ability on the longer term, once they recovered some oil markets, such as in China or other places, on their ability to even produce oil, because they can't get the replacement parts, they can't maintain the systems and so on. And so all of Trump's talk, and also the media's talk, about how Maduro has ruined the oil industry and has caused underinvestment, well, it's all the United States sanctions' fault, actually.
So, I mean, Chavistas have been in power since almost 24 years. Is there no legitimate basis for a criticism to be made that diversification of the economy could have been pursued in this era at some level at least?
Yeah, of course. But it's a very complicated question. It's one that I've actually studied quite a bit. The problem is that first of all, the irony is a little bit that already since the 1970s, Carlos Andres Perez, who was one of the first to nationalize the oil industry, recognized the need to diversify the economy. And so since the 1970s, there's always been presidents who said, we need to diversify, we need to diversify. They all recognized the need. And Chavez, that was like one of his main mantras, was also the need to diversify the economy. The problem is that when you have such a predominant sector, the governments kept on being in a dilemma. Either they let the petrodollars flow into the country, and what they tried to sow, and this was the major slogan really of the Chavez administration, was to, actually even before that, was a slogan that Chavez took over from previous presidents, was to quote unquote sow the oil. In other words, to plant the oil, so to speak, to get other industries to invest in other industries in order to diversify the economy. The problem is, and this is a long recognized problem among economists, is that when you try to do that, the petrodollars tend to cause inflation and make everything else more expensive. And that makes it difficult for those other industries then to be competitive in any shape or form. And so you start planning the economy more and more. And unless you have a really centrally planned economy, it just always ends up going wrong. And that's basically what happened under Chavez as well. Now, they really tried hard, and it was very difficult. And I think to some extent, Chavez did succeed. A lot of new industries were started. Venezuela started producing its own cell phones with the help of the Chinese. They launched a satellite. Of course, lots of it was technology that was imported, but these were things, they started producing their own cars, they producing their own bicycles, they produced all kinds of technologies, but it never was really sustainable, and they eventually crashed and burned, especially under once the economic crisis hit. So yeah, they could have done more. The other alternative, and this is something where I think the actual mistake was, the mistake wasn't so much to try to diversify the economy by using the petrodollars. Well, in a way it was, but what I mean is that what technically you should do, and Chavez recognized early in his presidency, is save some of those petrodollars for bad times when the dollar goes down. And there was a mechanism instituted for that. Unfortunately, because of the economic need of the population, that is, a large extent of poverty and so on, there was always this temptation to siphon off those funds before the economic downturn happened, before the price of oil went down, to try to invest in education and healthcare, which is what Chavez did. But then the funds were depleted when the price of oil finally did go down. And actually, Bolivia didn't make that mistake under Morales. That they actually did do basically what amounts to counter-cyclical spending. That is when the economic cycle goes down. They were able to maintain their spending because they had a savings account in order to do it. Venezuela did not, and actually ended up cutting down the state spending, and it made the economic crisis even worse. And now this was. Poor foresight was also, an attempt to do what they thought was best for the country. It's, I think, to some extent, it's understandable, but it was a mistake. But it's very, very difficult for countries to do these kinds of things. So I think we need some understanding there. I mean, it's just always so easy to just say, "Oh yeah, these are bad economic managers," especially considering how intractable and how difficult the economic problem is.
That's very good that you provide that context, because I think this is exactly what's missing in the media. And now let's return to the current issues. Since the US aggression against Venezuela that led to the kidnap of Nicolas Maduro, Vice President Delcy Rodríguez has assumed de facto leadership in Caracas. While she publicly condemned the US intervention and said that Maduro remains legitimate president, her government has at the same time signaled openness to dialogue and cooperation with Washington under the threat of further US strikes. Reports and official statements suggest that discussions are underway around a political transition, economic stabilization, and the future control and export of Venezuelan oil, potentially involving US corporations. Can you first provide our viewers with an overview of the internal power dynamics in Venezuela with a focus on Delcy Rodríguez, and then assess this dual posture by her government, at one hand rejecting intervention rhetorically, while on the other hand engaging pragmatically with the United States?
Yeah, so in terms of the internal situation, I mean, Delcy Rodríguez, first of all, just to give it a little bit of a background on her, she is the daughter of a very famous Venezuelan political activist who was murdered in, gosh, I think it was the 1970s. I'm forgetting now exactly when it was. And she and her brother became active kind of as a result of that in the 80s and 90s. And her brother is president of the National Assembly, and she has long held important positions in various places in the government, both under Chavez and then under Maduro. And she's often has been considered a bit of a hardliner. I mean, I think she's evolved over the decades. I actually had many opportunities to interact with her when I was living in Venezuela in the early 2000s. So I think, I think she's basically kind of evolved and isn't as much as a hardliner as she used to be. I could be wrong about that. Like I said, I haven't. That was a while ago when I knew her. But anyway, the point is that the entire government is, I think, very solidly behind her, including the military. Now, of course, you can never discount the possibility of factions and so on. But generally, it seems to me that she's pretty solidly in place, as far as we know, as far as we can tell. There don't seem to be major factions within the government that are threatening her at the moment. And partly, there's a rally behind her because of the action of the United States government. And this is, of course, also typical. The more you face threats from the outside, the more people tend to unite in face of that outside threat. And the more you tend to leave them alone, the more likely are factions and internal divisions, actually. Anyway, the second part of your question about sorry.
Yeah, the internal power dynamics that are now in place, and on one hand they're rhetorically very much against the United States, but on the other hand they're still pragmatically dealing with the US.
Right, and that's the other thing that's kind of also has to do with how news is being reported about Venezuela. That is, because people are leaving out the context under which, particularly the sanctions, the effect of the sanctions, they keep acting as though it was the Venezuelan government and President Maduro who decided, oh, we're going to leave the U.S. markets for oil and to devote ourselves to exporting oil to China or to, I don't know, to Iran or whatever. No, Iran doesn't make sense. But anyway, they make it sound like Venezuela was deliberately seeking out the enemies of the United States or something like that. But that's just complete nonsense. What actually happened was that the U.S. cut off Venezuela, and Venezuela was, as a result, forced to look elsewhere. And so, if the U.S. says, "Oh, we're going to force Venezuela to do business with the United States," it's just complete baloney. Venezuela always wanted to do business with with the United States in the first place, so it's not a big deal for Venezuela to say, "Yeah, sure, we welcome U.S. investors." They always have. There's no change in policy as far as Venezuela is concerned. Of course, there was this process under Chavez, which oil companies were forced to pay higher royalties for oil extraction, but it wasn't an astronomical amount or anything like that. And they just said that they wanted 50% state participation in joint ventures. So, in other words, foreign oil companies had to roll back a little bit their investment in joint ventures. But it wasn't, a huge, unprecedented, unheard of move. Venezuela's oil industry had been nationalized already in the 1970s. And this is also, of course, another thing that is always left out there. Trump makes it sound like Venezuela stole the oil and the investments and the production facilities and all that. It's also complete nonsense. Over and over. And again, every time there was a change in oil policy, the foreign oil companies were compensated at market rates. And then sometimes it ended up in arbitration and so on, and there were disputes. But anyway, it ended up they ended up being compensated according to the policies. Now there are some exceptions to this, and it's a complicated story that we don't need to go into. But that has in the most of the cases that was the case. So in other words, it's easy for Delcy Rodríguez to say, we welcome investments, we welcome U.S. participation here. And there's a whole bunch of other demands that Marco Rubio made that also are completely ludicrous. For example, we demand that Venezuela kicks out Hamas and Hezbollah. Well, they never were there in the first place, so it's no big deal for Venezuela to say to agree to something. I mean, not that they even have to. I mean, that hasn't been on the agenda right now. But I'm just saying that there's a whole bunch of demands. Or, for example, that Venezuela has to stop sending its criminals and migrants to the United States. Well, Venezuela never did something like that in the first place. These were, economic refugees, essentially, and that were caused by U.S. sanctions. If you would lift the sanctions, there won't be any economic refugees. It's as simple as that. So it's very easy for Delcy Rodríguez to present herself internally, of course, for the country, taking a hard line against U.S. intervention and against U.S. violation of national sovereignty. At the same time, towards the Trump administration, to put on a friendly face and say, "Hey, we're open for negotiation." As a matter of fact, Maduro had said that, and there were negotiations before that under Maduro. I mean, my argument has always been that the only reason Maduro was actually kidnapped, because there's not going to be a real policy change, is that Trump wanted an easy win to present to the world for his policies and how successful he is, and that's what he's really all about, is to show these kinds of have some dramatic move in order to show how powerful he is, even though when policy-wise it's kind of on some level it's meaningless. I mean, in terms of actually changing Venezuela, it's meaningless, but in terms of his ability, and of course, in terms of the violation of international law, it's extremely significant.
Let's do some hypotheticals and start with scenario one. Let's stick to that for a second. Let's say the US gets its wish, that the government steps down, the opposition comes into place, and you probably know more than me about the opposition figures and who would be placed there at head, and they institute everything that the United States wants. What would the economic program look like, and what effects would it have on the people of Venezuela?
I mean, first, before I go into that, one note is that, of course, that President Trump and Marco Rubio haven't even really said that changing government is on the agenda. They've kind of just put that off into the future and even denied that Maria Corina Machado was popular enough or had enough support within the country to take the presidency at the moment. But if she were to take power, and now she is really basically complete Trump clone in many ways. Now, not in terms of perhaps her style, but in terms of her policies, I would say, by and large, absolutely. She's extremely classist. She's extremely right-wing. She basically favors selling Venezuela's oil, that's already under the ground, as if they're, selling oil fields, essentially. She's completely in favor of complete privatization of absolutely everything. I mean, she is somebody who I can't remember her slogan, but she had a slogan about capitalism for everyone or something. I mean, she's a very, very right-wing, especially economically. I'm not even sure. I don't know what she's like in terms of, if she subscribes to, kind of a right-wing libertarianism. I don't think so. I really don't. I think she's more of an authoritarian, and like Trump in that sense. But he absolutely favors policies that would be comparable also to Argentina's Milei government of, like I said, privatizing everything and deregulating everything, and there's extremist forms of neoliberal capitalism you can imagine. That seems absolutely clear. And the other element I do think is that she is absolutely intent of wiping Chavismo or the Bolivarian Revolution off of the Venezuelan political map. And that's why I think she would be very authoritarian if she were to take power. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why the Chavistas, think it would be, quite scary for them. Because it would mean persecution throughout the country for as long as she's president or takes over.
Scenario two is the United States decides to take out the Rodriguez government, bombs it, and there's a large-scale invasion or some sort of military action. What consequences do you think that would have for Venezuelan society, and would it be successful in installing a new regime?
Yeah, that's something that that had been basically something that has been floated all the time, and it's kind of what Venezuelan government suspected on some level it might be possible. I never believed it, and the reason is very simple, and I think it's also why it didn't happen and won't happen, is that it would be almost impossible for such an invasion to succeed. It would be another Vietnam for Venezuela. I think there's little doubt about it. The Venezuelan population is armed, it's mobilized, it's politicized. It seems to me that they would have to deal with an insurgency. They might be have a quick success like in Iraq, but they would have to deal with another 10 years of insurgency or something like that. And of course, Venezuela has had a history, a bit of a guerrilla movement, not very much, and they were incorporated into society relatively quickly every time they cropped up. But Colombia has had a very, very long history of that, as we all know. And there's no reason to believe why Venezuela wouldn't follow that as well if something like that, like an outside invasion were to happen. So I just don't see it happen. And I think the U.S. military planners know this, and that's the reason why an invasion probably would not happen. Same thing, I would say, applies to Cuba, actually. And it's probably the main reason why there hasn't been an invasion of Cuba, even though they would like to do that. So It seems unlikely to me because the US government and the military know it. But again, Trump is crazy, I think, and so you can't always completely discount the possibility.
Yeah, and then we have the MAGA base also, that he actually ran on the platform where Venezuela wasn't even mentioned in the elections, that he's going to be the peace president, and he even got the FIFA Peace Prize for that. I don't know how that will look on his resume. But let's get to geopolitics and the global reactions. At the recent UN security meeting, China and Russia strongly criticized the US, stating it violated international law, whereas the US countered, stating it was a law enforcement operation against an illegitimate criminal responsible for both drug trafficking and terrorism. Europe has avoided any harsh condemnation of the US thus far. For example, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Foreign Minister Johann Wadephol recently stated that classifying the legality of the US military operation is a complex issue and requires more thorough analysis. What is notable is that Germany is quite vocal when it comes to values and a rules-based order, when it comes to criticizing Russia on Ukraine. However, in this case, it remains opaque and it's very complex. In your view, in particular, Germany's reaction or lack thereof, how would you interpret this?
I think the German government and other governments of Europe are clearly afraid of Trump. I think they're intimidated. They're afraid that if they say something that is out of line too much, that they will immediately be hit with new tariffs or some other kind of retaliation. And that's a reasonable fear, I guess, because Trump is like that. So, but on the other hand, I think they completely lack courage and they lack foresight as to what the meaning and the implications are of this action. And so they're selling they're basically trying to buy themselves a short-term gain at the expense of the longer term, which is the erosion of international law. And so that's very, very sad to see. I think the governments of Latin America, that is particularly, of course, the center-left and leftist governments of Latin America, were far more forceful in the UN Security Council meeting, and far braver because they could potentially face the same consequences as Europe. But they were very, very forceful in condemning it. Now, of course, not the Trump allies, like I mentioned in Argentina, but the others have been very forceful. And so, yeah, it's very sad to see Europe just buckling to this pressure.
Venezuela has long been a strategic partner for both Russia and China through energy investments, armed cooperation, oil-backed lending, debt for oil arrangements basically, and broader geopolitical alignment. If the United States succeeds in a regime change in Venezuela and effectively gains control over Venezuelan oil flows and revenues, or makes some sort of compromise even, what do you think are the geopolitical implications for Russia and China? I mean, we already talked about the capture of an oil tanker that the United States just undertook, but what broader impacts might we expect on regional stability and even global security in that case?
Well, again, the U.S. Capture of various oil tankers, even these are unilaterally sanctioned, and the actions are carried out by the United States completely unilaterally. So basically, according to international law, they basically amount to piracy. So in that sense, that's again another step in the erosion of international law and destabilizing, because it makes it possible for other countries to use similar justifications and engage in the same kinds of practices. Now, in terms of the effects, I think on Russia and China, I don't think it's going to be that serious. As a matter of fact, I think it would actually benefits them to some extent, because they're going to see it as an opportunity to engage in similar actions in their own spheres of influence, which is something that Trump actually seems to favor. That is, this whole concept of the spheres of influence type of foreign policy. So I don't think it's going to impact either Russia or China. Especially China, is importing a tiny fraction of its energy needs from Venezuela. So it's a drop in the bucket as far as China is concerned. So having that oil flow stop makes no difference whatsoever for China. And Russia is walking a little bit of a finer line because of all of its own international entanglements in Ukraine, etc., and with Europe more generally. So it's a little bit more complicated. And I've seen Russia with partially withdraw from support from Venezuela. And China hasn't been that vocal or tried to support Venezuela that much, really. I think it could have done a lot more. But at least both of them made very strong statements in the UN Security Council. But in terms of their actions, they haven't really done anything, I would say, to really support Venezuela at the moment, other than to continue the policies that were already in place. I think that pretty much summarizes it.
And do you think part of it is also because Venezuela is sort of a bargaining chip? You talked about the sphere of influence where Russia could say, okay, we will not support Venezuela, and therefore let's make some compromises. We saw today, for example, Russia used a hypersonic ballistic missile against Ukraine, or it was yesterday, I think. And we see the escalation clearly on Russia's front, and perhaps this would be a bad deal for Europe, but at least for Russia, this could be a bargaining chip. And in China's perception, this could also be a bargaining chip when it comes to its conflict with Taiwan. Do you also see some of that shaping out in all of this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there was talk that Russia had explicitly even told the Trump administration in back channels that if you're willing to loosen up on Ukraine, we'll concede Venezuela to you. And I think there's definitely, and that's why the European position is so mind-boggling, because this is going to negatively affect Europe, of course. And if they could be much more forceful in confronting the Trump administration of Venezuela, they would have a much stronger hand in confronting Russia and the Ukraine. But because they're basically conceding the U.S. administration's point on Venezuela, they're going to have to concede Russia's position on Ukraine. I mean, it's a very bad deal for Europe, I would say. That it's their position with respect to Venezuela is very, very bad because of that.
Yeah, it sounds to me also more like what happened with Gaza's Trump peace plan, where effectively, I think it was Russia, China, or both withdrew and did not even issue a veto. And that's when Trump's peace plan was basically authorized as being what will be pursued between Palestine and Israel. So something like that is brewing. But I also want to focus on Latin America. I mean, President Trump made a series of usually his normal provocative statements to the media about countries. For example, when it came to Colombia, he said, "Operation Colombia sounds good to me." About Cuba, he stated, quote, "looks like it's ready to fall," unquote. And he warned to Mexico to, quote, "get their act together," unquote. And even in Europe, there's growing concern that Trump will at some point take over Greenland militarily. And he keeps making jokes about Denmark just having a few sleds there. It'll be no problem to take it over military. How serious do you think statements like this now need to be taken by leaders and people in Latin America and in Europe?
Very seriously. I'm not sure that the military threats need to be taken that seriously, because again, what could the United States possibly do with respect to Colombia and Mexico militarily? I don't think there's very much. The economic issues are much more dangerous, especially for Cuba. I mean, and Venezuela right now. I mean, if the Trump administration decides to economically isolate these countries, that it always brings with it enormous amounts of suffering for the general population. And so, in that sense, I think it's very, very dangerous. And I'm not entirely sure what they can do with it. I mean, I think Chavez actually did have a strategy to deal with it, but unfortunately it's gotten lost, which the strategy is basically for Latin American countries to band together and to increase the trade amongst themselves, and to basically try to actually proactively cut out the United States as its major trading partner. Like I said, Venezuela never really did that because it was still supplying lots of oil to the United States for the entirety of Chavez's presidency. But there were moves going in that direction of trying to insulate themselves from the United States. And since then, with the whole kind of the loss of that first pink wave of leftist governments and so on, there's been a complete falling apart of UNASUR, for example, which was the main economic project to ensure this kind of economic independence. So these countries are extremely vulnerable to this economic blackmail, really, all of them. And the most suffering is going to happen immediately, most immediately, I think, actually, is in Cuba, where we could possibly see a famine if the economic trend continues because of Venezuela's, because of the economic attacks against Venezuela and the prevention of trade between Venezuela and Cuba. But in terms of military, like I said, even an invasion of Venezuela is unlikely. That makes an invasion of Colombia and Mexico, of course, even more remote. But I mean, the U.S. couldn't possibly do that. I don't know what else they could do. I mean, don't have a leg to stand on to claim to kidnap the presidents of these countries. Of course, Trump kind of signaled in that direction that Gustavo Petro himself is some kind of drug lord or something, but it's just, everybody knows on the face of it, it's just complete nonsense. He's dedicated his life to fighting drug trafficking, actually, before he ever even became president. And there's absolutely zero evidence for any such claim. So, and of course, the same thing goes for President Sheinbaum of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. So, yeah, I don't really see any military options for the U.S. government in those areas. But the economic one is tremendous and has to be taken seriously, and the strategy needs to be developed.
I want to return to the media before I end this interview. One of the channels that I've been watching is the Tagesschau. And one of the most notable things is that they've had neoconservative figures like John Bolton on, who, because he's become a fierce critic of Donald Trump, and he stated on television that Trump didn't go far enough and did half the job. And he was just basically thrown some curveballs, nothing significant. He was basically asked, and I think it was Sandra Maischberger on the Tagesschau on January 7th, and she basically asked him that why should the US go all the way? And certain experts cite that the Iraq war, which you were part of, left a whole catastrophe at sight. And it's very notable for me because whenever it comes to the wars of the West, they cite certain experts. But when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, the media is very categorical. So, for example, they'll say terror Angriff from Hamas, terror attack of Hamas of October 7th. They have a categorical term. Or when it comes to, for example, Russia's invasion, they will say very clearly an attack in violation of international law or unprovoked invasion. But when it comes to something like the US attacking Venezuela or capturing Maduro, and see, I'm using the same thing, capturing, not saying kidnapping. They're very, very careful about the terms. And on January 4th, the Tagesschau also cited Chuck Schumer, the minority leader of the Senate, who said that basically the Trump administration violated the US Constitution by attacking Venezuela. And the Tagesschau once again failed to provide any context that presidents like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama especially violated the Constitution several times, and in Obama's case had wars with 7 countries. So these are my observations about the Western media. It's not just the framing, also terminology. Can you share your observations and also share for people who are watching the sanitized, the Western version that conflicts geopolitics with human rights, that fails to provide adequate context, what people should do to gain an accurate picture of Venezuela and other geopolitical issues?
Yeah, I mean, the problem you describe you describe it very well, very accurately, I think. You just see it over and over again in the so-called mainstream media. And across the board, of course, not just the German media, but also US media, whether it's the New York Times or The Guardian even. And it's just extremely disappointing. But we shouldn't be so completely surprised. I mean, these media outlets are, for the most part, owned by the same conglomerates and corporate owners that own the military-industrial complex, and therefore they have a vested interest. And any journalist who tries to go against that vested interest by trying to present a more accurate picture of what's happening that would use the terminology in a more accurate way would probably be fired on in absolutely no time. So they're already indoctrinated. They don't even see the world in a different way. And I mean, the journalists who work there, and if anybody steps out of the line, they're immediately controlled. So we really can't put our hopes, I think, in the corporate media. I think really that's why it's so important to have alternative media outlets such as yours, or the ones I've worked for, because and thank goodness we have that opportunity. Of course, it's very difficult to kind of be heard and to get the message out. But anybody who does run across it, hopefully, will see that that there is a different way of seeing the world, and will then start seeking out those other sources of information, because it's just so. And what helps, though, of course, is to have that in the back of your mind. Once you're educated about that, and then you can, I think, actually read the mainstream media, as long as you keep in mind this kind of misleading terminology that they keep using, so that you can continue to be informed by them to some extent, as long as you keep in mind how misleading the headlines are, or the terminology that they use. But it's only if you are educated in terms of seeking out other sources first, and seeing that there are different ways of thinking about these things, and realize the extreme discrepancy and hypocrisy, really, of the mainstream media or the corporate media. But we're only going to do that if we continue to support alternative media sources.
I think this is a good point to end the conversation. Gregory Wilpert, journalist and author, thank you so much for your time and insights. And this time, please come back, not after 7 years, but in a few weeks or months again, back on our show, yeah?
Okay, my pleasure.
And thank you for tuning in today. If you like the journalism that we undertook in this video and would like to follow us going forward, then make sure to click on the subscription button below. And don't forget to participate in our crowdfunding campaign. Only a few days are left, and your participation could decide whether we could continue broadcasting in the coming months ahead. We don't take any money from corporations or governments, all with the goal of providing you with information that is free from any external influence. Hence, we only depend on our viewers, you, to continue our independent and non-profit journalism. I thank you for your support and for tuning in. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you next time.